Well, I think they probably thought these particles I saw might have come from that. But there are thousands of these things, and they go out for, it looks like miles.
Gemini 5 demonstrated the 8-day endurance necessary for an Apollo lunar mission.
I just want to quickly go over some of the photographic proof and evidence directly from the NASA archive.
Presidents may not have the need to know on the UFO subject.
Proved that man could fly into orbit around the Earth and return live and well to talk about it.
Now, one of the major mission goals for our astronauts in space was to take pictures. That's the simple truth. Now, due to the fact that NASA reported many mission photos or mission picture archives as lost or destroyed, had it not been for the declassification of these incredible VTR transcript documents.
You often hear people, like mainstream or conventional scientists or people in the media also saying things like, it would be impossible to keep a secret on something as extraordinary as real UFOs. Are you kidding? NASA, they would love, or SETI, they would love to announce such a finding to the world. And I just laugh. I just laugh. In NASA, for example, they've had classified connections there its entire existence. When it was founded in 1958, it's deeply embedded with the United States military. They've participated in numerous classified missions with the United States military. They are bound by military secrecy protocols when they are engaged in those things. And on top of that, I mean, such people who make these arguments, it's like they have not the slightest recognition that there is a classified world that exists that has been dealing with the UFO phenomenon since the beginning. And they make these assumptions because, quite frankly, they don't know anything about the UFO history. Like, it's obvious when you listen to these people talk. They just don't know it. And they haven't studied the development of the secrecy apparatus around the UFO subject, as I and many other people have done, since it really sprung up in the 1940s, and significantly so.
These classic UFO photographs have been seen for decades. This UFO was photographed by a sheep farmer. This was taken in 1950 from a man in Oregon. Photos like this were scoffed at by skeptics in the 1950s. This photo was taken in Madrid, Dios, Peru. This one was taken by Stephen Pratt in Yorkshire, United Kingdom.
Altitude, 67 miles. Speed, Mach 6, 4,104 miles an hour. The highest and fastest a winged aircraft has ever flown.
This is the X-15 in its final stage of development. This run, if successful, will mark the beginning of a whole new era of flight research.
Looks okay down here, Scott. Okay to go? Right. Roger. 25. 25. Cooling move down. Got it. Launch. I'm reading 320. Launch tank is holding at about 55. About 1, 2, the picture went open. How's it work out? Look real good, Scotty. You made about a 10-degree turn to the right when you came on.
Early
Early on in American post-World War II history, Eisenhower and his cabinet understood that there had to be a law established to protect the public and therefore the people from information that could cause panic or disturbance to the economy and the American way of life. That's where the executive order comes in.
To the X-15 research airplane team, the scientists, engineers, technicians, and pilots of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the Department of Defense, and North American Aviation incorporated for the conception, design, development, construction, and flight operation of the X-15 research airplane, which contributed valuable research information in the supersonic and hypersonic speed regime up to the fringes of space, and who have thereby made an outstanding contribution to American leadership in aerospace science and technology and in the operation of manned space flight. NASA Deputy Administrator Hugh L. Dryden.
£57,000 of thrust with a throttle attached. No engine like this had ever existed before, but Thiokol built one for the X-15. Now, what kind of airframe could be designed to carry such an engine?
The X-15 was designed and built to take the stresses encountered at hypersonic speeds, to go to extreme high altitude, and to beat the heat. Survive the extreme high temperatures that build up on the wing, fuselage, and tail during the re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere. The engineering research contribution we made at North American Aviation to the X-15 project was to take NASA's proposal to build this aircraft and to find out how they could be met. For example, they proposed to use a new nickel alloy metal for the protective sheath or skin on all three of the airframes of the X-15. We had to find out how it could be used.
Inconel X was the name of the new nickel alloy. It was developed to withstand the searing temperatures at hypersonic speeds, temperatures of 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit or more. But to use Inconel X, it had to be cross-welded, and no one had been able to do it before. A major milestone was passed when North American discovered how it could be done. North American also originated the idea of fairings along each side of the X-15 fuselage to house control cables and hydraulic lines. This left the entire fuselage volume for power plant plumbing, as well as fuel and propellant tanks. Another invaluable North American contribution was the X-15 flight simulator, permitting pilots and ground controllers to plan and practice flights without ever leaving the ground. From an exact replica of the X-15 cockpit, the pilot could actuate hydraulic and control systems identical to those on the aircraft itself. All this was tied into an analog computer that could program actual X-15 missions and simulate every conceivable in-flight problem the pilot might expect to face. Practice in the flight simulator was just one phase of pre-flight preparation. Another took place in the centrifuge at the Navy's Air Development Test Center at Johnsville, Pennsylvania. Now, the first of 3 X-15s was about to begin a series of test flights. The schedule called for an orderly progression of tests. In the first flights, the X-15 would remain attached to the B-52. Then a glide flight would be tried. Only then would powered flight be attempted.
Attached to a specially designed wing pylon, Major White and his X-15 were carried aloft by a modified NB-52 mothership. White rapidly accelerated to a top speed of Mach 4.8. After 81 seconds of powered flight, the XLR-99 engine exhausted its fuel supply and shut down, leaving the X-15 to coast to a new FIA absolute altitude record for piloted aircraft of 317,450 feet, or 59.6 miles above Earth. While his flight was at apogee and he was experiencing over 3 minutes of zero gravity, Major White was able to look out the left side window of his X-15. There are things out there. There absolutely is. In the August 3rd, 1962 edition of Life magazine, Major White commented further about his UFO encounter he had while at the very edge of space.
And none of this is really all that outrageous. All you have to do is a little bit of research on it, and you can see how the development of, for example, black budget types of structures evolved in the 1940s and 50s, frequently connected with the UFO phenomenon. Secrecy around UFOs has been quantifiably knowable since the 1940s. We have classified, we have a number of classified documents that in the late 1970s were declassified during America's golden era of freedom of information. It was an amazing period in the late 70s. It was after Vietnam, it was after Watergate. Jimmy Carter also issued an executive order that provided a bonanza of formerly classified documents that I don't think anyone expected these things to come out, but they did come out. And they speak to this, about the fact that the matter of flying saucers or UFOs is rated top secret by the intelligence community. And many, many such statements. So we know that they took it seriously.
Then on the 12th of August, just 8 days later, Major Bob White was up before the cameras after his 136,500-foot record-breaking altitude flight.
The flight today offered, I would say, no problems, and nothing that could be considered a limitation as far as man's ability to fly an aircraft.
Several months earlier, during one of NASA test pilot Joseph Walker's X-15 flights, the camera system captured what Walker later described as being 5 or 6 disc-shaped or cylindrical objects near his aircraft. During a May 11th, 1962 lecture, Joe Walker also claimed that one of his mission objectives was to detect and film UFOs at high altitude.
At what point did you reach your maximum speed?
If you notice the vapor trail from the engine, at the instant it cut off, that was the point at which I reached the maximum speed.
Now, what was your altitude then?
Around 66,000.
On May 11th, 1962, during his lecture, Walker showed several photographs to the audience of these UFOs captured on film, although NASA has since only ever made one of these frames public.
Joe, how does it feel to be the fastest living human?
I don't know if I feel much different than I did yesterday, except that the waiting for the flight is over finally.
Dear Mr. Deal, thank you for your letter concerning the film of the unknown objects seen by Major White on his X-15 flight to 314,750 feet. The film to which you refer is property of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration's Flight Research Center, located here at Edwards Air Force Base. We suggest you write to the below address for further information on the film. October 16th, 1962. Dear Mr. Deal, the film you request is considered a technical film. As such, it is under the control of our technical personnel. It is available only to research groups on a bona fide, need-to-know basis. For films of a general nature, I suggest you contact the Office of Educational Audiovisual, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Washington 25, D.C. Very truly yours, Ralph B. Jackson, Public Information Officer. November 23rd, 1962. Dear Mr. Deal, as I explained in my letter of October 16th, 1962, the film you seek are of a technical nature and therefore are available only to official technical groups on a need-to-know basis. As of this date, I am unable to find any official recognition of your group. However, as you show a great deal of enthusiasm and desire to see these films, and the films are by no means confidential, I invite you to visit us at your convenience, and at that time, I will only be too happy to show you the films. January 24th, 1963. Dear Mr. Deal, the bug-eye camera footage taken on the X-15 flights of April 30th and July 17th, 1962 are public domain material and has been released to the news media. To date, there has been no production film made available to the public including this footage. This footage is designated as stock footage, and we do not loan out stock footage to the general public. The reason for this is that there is no soundtrack describing what you are seeing. However, at your own expense, we can make available a work print at approximately 20 cents a foot. I hope in the near future we will have the footage you speak of in a production film. June 11th, 1981. Dear Mr. Greenwood, enclosed is the only photograph we have available which relates to an unidentified object as seen by the X-15 pilot, Major Robert White, on July 17th, 1962. For further information on obtaining film on unidentified objects, please contact the addresses below. Norton Air Force Base, Film Department, San Bernardino, California. Sincerely, Marie A. Jones, Audiovisual Services Coordinator, Media Services Branch, Public Affairs Division. Dear Sir, this may be regarded as a FOIA request, 5 U.S.C. Section 552. Requested are all motion picture films, gun camera films, bug-eye camera footage, and any and all photos of the still camera variety, plus all documents, notes, memos, cables, summaries, and conclusions that may be located in the files, records of NASA regarding the sighting of UFOs by X-15 pilots Joseph A. Walker and Major Robert White, 1989. Dear Mr. Giordano, enclosed are copies of all of the documents we have located concerning UFOs. With regard to any photographs, the audiovisual branch located here at NASA headquarters was not able to locate any photographs taken of UFOs by either Joseph A. Walker or Major Robert White. Sincerely, Patricia M. Wright.
Just before the time that NASA and the Air Force were successfully launching the X-15 missions as well as capturing UFOs on camera, Eisenhower was growing weary of the power that the military-industrial complex was garnering in politics. Now, he clearly understood that war should not be glorified to the extent of becoming like a profit-making business.
I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell.
This speech did not get very much attention. When a new president is coming to power, as John Kennedy was, the spotlight was not on Dwight Eisenhower.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions.
There was a feeling at the time that this must have been written by some speechwriter who just sneaked into the speech.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
3 months ago, we got contacted by a family up in Minnesota saying that we have documents from Malcolm Moose. He was responsible in part for drafting the military-industrial complex speech.
These new papers give us written evidence that this was not just some caprice of Eisenhower's or something by some speechwriter.
You see the evolution of his speech from May 1959 to 1961.
And he wanted to give this speech for a long time, 2 years.
Fighting men of World War II or Korea.
There was one person in Dwight Eisenhower's life whom he really confided almost everything to, and that was his brother Milton.
There's one particular document where the speechwriters had already drafted their version of the speech, only to see Milton come along and totally revamp what had already been written.
When Milton Eisenhower was taking notes and writing things on the drafts of these speeches, the speechwriters knew that it wasn't Milton talking, it was Ike.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
He would see magazines with advertisements for some, new warplane or some bomb, and he got so angry he'd take the magazine and throw it into the fireplace of the Oval Office because he felt that defense spending should not be something that would be encouraged by companies who are seeking commercial gain.
We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic process.
The development of space bombing systems is already being conducted by the USA at the present time under the NIBS program. This program includes a series of special reports. One of them envisages the development of carrier satellites of space-to-surface class missiles orbiting at an altitude of about 200 kilometers. The other projects envisage the creation of strategic satellite bombers in low and high orbits. The practical creation of a space bombing system is considered feasible in the near future. An important role in attaining supremacy in space, this was especially stressed by the former Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, General Thomas White. The first steps in developing manned spaceships are the work of the experimental X-15 aircraft and the manned satellite of the Mercury project. Subsequent phases in this direction should be orbital gliding bombers and reconnaissance aircraft being developed in the Dinosaur project, and also in the initial stage by several leading American companies. The creation of manned space stations and command posts are planned for the future. The moon is considered to be an important element of the U.S. deterrent force in space. Its role from this point of view had already been stressed in January of 1958.
Major Robert M. White steps from a van at Edwards Air Force Base to go aloft in the X-15 for an assault on the altitude record now held by that craft. The stubby-winged X-15 is carried skyward by a B-52 mothership. Today it's planned to release White and his plane 45,000 feet over Nevada. And when he re-enters the Earth's atmosphere for a landing, he undergoes 5 times the force of gravity. Major White is now eligible for astronaut wings, awarded to all pilots who fly higher than 50 miles. His speed during the flight was 3,700 miles an hour. Not a record, but he wasn't riding a local either. Seven-year-old son Gregory was a proud witness. The saga of the X-15 and its pilots is marked at the White House as the 4 men who have piloted the plane received the famed Collier Trophy that is awarded for noted contributions to aviation. Along with Major White, Scott Crossfield, Joseph Walker, and Commander Forrest Peterson are honored for their work with the plane. Honors for men of daring who have contributed greatly to the conquest of space. Folded in a cider canister, a 13-story balloon is hoisted into space atop a Thor rocket. This is a test preliminary to orbiting another space listening post next fall, which will inflate just as this one does, and then orbit the Earth as Echo 2. In this test, the shiny balloon inflates perfectly and then soars 922 miles above the Earth in a completely successful test. The Queen Elizabeth sails for Europe with a distinguished passenger. Former President Eisenhower is making his first trip abroad as a private citizen since 1929. And he says this is going to be a fun trip. The general is accompanied by his wife and their 2 grandchildren, Dwight David, 14, and Barbara Ann, 13. Mr. Eisenhower will make but one official appearance. He will address an international teachers' conference in Stockholm. In a shipboard interview, the general says he hopes to carry abroad the message that the United States wants peace but will not be pushed around. A bon voyage to Mr. Eisenhower, private citizen.
The object that was reported to the International UFO Bureau in 1967 appeared bluish at first and then changed. The eyewitness was none other than Jimmy Carter, former president of the United States.
But first I want to ask you, this is a question that I think is very important to me and very important to the country. When you were in office, and I don't know when this happened or if it happened, did you go through the secret files, the UFO documents? Because if I was president, that'd be the first thing I did.
You know, it's funny. My daughters asked the very same question.
They did?
Yeah.
Would you be allowed to tell your daughters what was in those files?
No.
You would not?
No.
Now that you're out of office, you can do anything you want, right?
True, yeah. But I'm not telling you.
You're not telling me. You're not telling me what? Are you not telling me that you looked at them?
I'm not telling you nothing.
Are there really great secrets that you know that you can't share with people?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are.
All right, President Clinton, first things first before we move on. UFOs. You've been the president. You've seen all the info. Are they real?
You know, they've given us an idea for our next book.
Well, what do you know? What can you tell us?
The truth is that we've never proved one, but there are things flying around up there that we haven't fully identified yet. And keep in mind, there are basically 1 billion galaxies in an ever-expanding universe. I mean, you can't even get your mind around the sheer number of things that are out there.
But you've seen this.
And
you've seen the data.
Well, no one knows, but I think that the probability is that there's something you would call life somewhere else.
When it comes to aliens, there's some things I just can't tell you on air. But what is true, and I'm actually being serious here, is that there's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are. We can't explain how they moved, their trajectory.
Before we go, one of the things you have as president is the access to all the information in the world, all the mysteries out there. And I was just struck in the last couple of weeks, we're reading more and more reports of Navy pilots seeing lots and lots of UFOs. Have you been briefed on that? What do you make of it?
I have. I think it's probably, I want them to think whatever they think. They do say, I mean, I've seen and I've read and I've heard, and I did have one very brief meeting on it, but people are saying they're seeing UFOs. Do I believe it? Not particularly.
Do you think you'd know if there were evidence of extraterrestrials?
Well, I think our great pilots would know. And some of them really see things that are a little bit different than in the past. So we're going to see, but we'll watch it. You'll be the first to know.
I won't talk to you about what I know about it, but it's very interesting
But Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
So you're saying you may declassify?
Oh.
You'll take it?
Well, I'll have to think about that one, right?
And you never write about them?
No.
Maybe at a time in your life that you're like, oh, I'm 90, I'm going to do it.
No.
No, nothing.
It is a quite well-established truth in the UFO research field that presidents may not have the need to know on the UFO subject. This is because they come and go within a 4 or 8 year term if they're lucky. But the story goes that many presidents over the years have either been rumored to have been involved with the ET issue or have requested to be read into the subject. For example, there's a rumor that Eisenhower had an actual face-to-face meeting with ETs. There's also Jimmy Carter. What's more interesting is that now the last 4 presidents that have been in power seem to have some knowledge or have been briefed to some extent about ET or UFOs over the years.
Oh, I asked Obama. I asked Obama if aliens were real. What did he say? What did he say? He said he wouldn't answer the question. I said, well, that's a yes. I was just thinking about that the other day. Wasn't it just like a year ago that we got the report and then the people, like members, like the Secretary of the Navy or something went on 60 Minutes and said, yeah, it's real. And we're all just going on with our lives.
I know, it's crazy.
How are we just going on with our lives when we know that there are real UFOs out there? I think they're softening up the beach. They're just like, okay, they handled the video and the proof pretty well. Now let's let them know that there are aliens, because they're afraid we're going to freak out.
Yeah. The best part of my Mercury mission was naming it Sigma 7. Meaning a sum of engineering effort, not a fancy name like Freedom or Faith or Aurora. Not that I didn't appreciate those names, but I wanted to prove that there was a team of people working together to make this vehicle go. That's why I talk so wildly about knowing the engineers, how they were brothers and buddies, and all of them were. And that's what I saw as the ultimate on that mission, was an engineering test flight, where we weren't going to look around for fireflies.
Another space program that started up alongside the X-15 project was the Mercury project. When people first heard astronaut John Glenn's Fireflies, a now famous incident that almost had a War of the Worlds effect, you know, similar to Orson Welles' famous radio program that threw shock and awe into the United States when it aired.
They lit up like they're luminescent. I never saw anything like it. They're coming by the capsule, and they look like little stars, a whole shower of them coming by. They swirl around the capsule and go in front of the window, and they're all brilliantly lighted. They probably average maybe 7 or 8 feet apart, but I can see them all down below me also. Negative. They're very slow. They're not going away from me more than maybe 3 or 4 miles per hour. They're going at the same speed I am, approximately. They're only very slightly under my speed. Over. They do have a different motion, though, from me, because they swirl around the capsule and then depart back the way that I am looking. Are you receiving? Over. There are literally thousands of them. This is Friendship 7. Am I in contact with anyone? Over.
Project Mercury, a
America's first manned space program lasted from 1958 to 1963. The Mercury 7, test pilots all, Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, and Alan Shepard Jr. and Deke Slayton. Their task proved that man could fly into orbit around the Earth and return live and well to talk about it. Shepard was first in Freedom 7. His 15-minute suborbital hop on May 5, 1961, proved the United States was catching up to the Soviet Union. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy's call for a lunar landing.
Should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
America was launched into a race with the Soviets to be the first on the moon. On February 20, 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth in Friendship 7.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous. Roger, understand go for at least 7 orbits.
Carpenter did 3 orbits in May of '62. Schirra, 6, 5 months later. Cooper wound up the program with 22 orbits in May 1963.
Now, it may be true that this wasn't a spectacular UFO event, but rather an astronaut excited by seeing an unidentified phenomenon for the first time in space history. But we do know that NASA astronauts, as well as the general public, were in awe of this event when it first happened, which is proof enough that mankind is inherently keen and interested in what may be out there in space waiting for us.
We didn't know where those things came from. There was some conjecture that there would be some sort of living critters out there at that altitude. Sounds crazy now, but we didn't know a lot of very simple answers in those early days. Now we know.
It's really interesting to note the circumstances around the firing of Scott Carpenter as a NASA astronaut. Based on the interviews he did during the 90s regarding his experience with fireflies, one could deduce that NASA was trying to get a tighter control over their astronauts to prevent free will on space missions. You see, the reason that is used for firing him in the first place was that Scott became too distracted by examining the fireflies, ending with him banging on the outer hull of the capsule in which he claims the fireflies were emanating from. But by doing this firefly research, instead of sticking to his mission checklist, some would say the Apollo program's scripted events, he overshot his reentry because he did not follow his checklist, and he landed very far off target in the ocean.
I'm not sure when I ran out of fuel on the entry. It was down low, but what I was able to determine is that Max Faget's design of the blunt re-entry body was a good one, and it had sufficient aerodynamic stability to get through the entry without fuel. And that's what Max wanted it to do.
I don't want to appear to condemn Scott Carpenter. Scott Carpenter, he's a fine person, but nevertheless, he was not what I considered to be a competent test pilot. And we wanted test pilots there because they might find themselves in the position that he indeed found himself in. And he was very fortunate that he was able to get the spacecraft down without serious trouble.
He and I have been on opposite sides of the appraisal of my flight. He thinks it involves the the failure of the man, and I think it involves the failure of the machine. And I think there is no meeting between the two of us.
The reason for him missing re-entry was that he ran out of fuel to properly reorient the craft and maneuver into the atmosphere quicker. That appears to be a lie. Based on Scott's answer to the fuel problem, he even states that he doesn't recall running out of fuel. Additionally, you can find a recording of Scott's remarks while re-entering the atmosphere. This was recorded on a black box type of device, something like the VTR used in the Gemini program. And you can hear in that recording, he says that on his gauges that the fuel was low, not empty. This means that NASA had an answer for why they fired Scott publicly. It was a PR answer. You have to keep in mind, they wanted to make an example out of Scott for focusing way too much time on the Fireflies, therefore showing future NASA pilots that they shouldn't make this same mistake or they'll be fired.
Scott Carpenter got involved with playing with Fireflies, which was that same water I talked about in the environmental control system that cooled you. And it came out as NH2O, one molecule of water, which froze instantaneously into one snowflake, but a very tiny, tiny snowflake. These stuck on the outside of the spacecraft, they drifted around. This is what John called Fireflies. This is what Scott got involved with, banging the spacecraft and watching them come off. And as a result, both of them lost sight of the fact they had to have fuel left to fly the mission.
What were your expectations? What were your family's expectations of the experience?
We were going into the great unknown, to be honest with you. It was a great big unknown. I don't know, I didn't know what to expect. Certainly my wife with two small children didn't know what to expect. We kind of went there like babes in the wood.
Down in 12 Echo Devil Fox 1. Roger, 12 Echo Devil Fox 1, are you still on UHF? Roger, stand by. Down in 12 Echo Devil Fox 1. Roger, 12 Echo Devil Fox 1. Houston will not be able to check with you at this time. He's too busy. We'll get you a little later. Roger.
During 1965 and 1966, NASA astronauts flew an aggressive series of two-man missions into low Earth orbit in order to gain the experience needed to make the upcoming Apollo program a success. In a mere 20 months, 16 astronauts conducted a total of 10 missions in the Gemini spacecraft. All were launched by Titan II launch vehicles.
The Gemini UFO incident. I just want to quickly go over some of the photographic proof and evidence directly from the NASA archive. And like always, I will provide the NASA photo gallery ID numbers to every single photograph so you can verify them for yourself. Now, we all know the truth. The simple fact of the matter is NASA has been hiding the truth about this UFO incident since 1966, along with countless other UFO incidents. I believe NASA is slowly drip feeding the general public the truth about UFOs surrounding these various space programs going all the way back to the 60s and probably even the late 40s post-Roswell. NASA can no longer hide what they have tried so hard to desperately cover up because the evidence and the proof of NASA's secrets has become overwhelming. We've heard witness testimony of former NASA employees coming forward admitting they were paid to edit, crop, and delete any UFO-related photographs from the NASA archives. It is a well-documented fact.
My name is Donna Hare, and I worked at
Philco Ford Aerospace from 1967 to 1981. Most of the time I worked on site, in Building 8. I had the opportunity to do extra work during downtime, which was between missions, and I walked into a photo lab, which was the NASA lab across the hallway. I had a secret clearance, which is not that high, but I was able to go into restricted areas, which this was. At the time, I was talking to one of the techs in there, and he drew my attention to a photograph, a NASA photograph. It had a dot on it, and I said, "What is that?" Well, he drew my attention to it, and I said, "Is that a dot on the emulsion?" And he said, and he's smiling, and he has his hands crossed, and he said, "Round dots on the emulsion don't leave round shadows on the ground." And this was an aerial photograph of the Earth, I'm assuming the Earth, because it had pine trees on it, and the shadows of the craft, or whatever it was, were in the same angle as the trees. And by its very nature, UFO, and I wanted to clarify that to a gentleman that was talking to me, means unidentified. So I did not know what this was, but I realized at this point that it's very secret, that it was kept secret, because I asked him, "What are you going to do with this piece of information?" And he said, "We always airbrush these out before we sell them to the public."
The first two Gemini missions were flown without crews to test systems and the heat shield.
The powers that be finally decided on flight systems, and I guess one of the things that they were thinking of was that astronauts should talk to astronauts. So all of you took up different positions along the line. Can you describe how that functioned, how it worked when actually the first flights began?
Well, this made a lot of sense, because since we'd been training together, we were certainly the most experienced on all the different systems and the astronaut system interface. So that putting the rest of us in, when one made a flight, putting the rest of us in key positions around the world really made a lot of sense, because we knew what that astronaut making the flight was going through, and what he was, and knew the systems, and knew the cockpit, and knew all the switches and everything better than anybody else.
Gemini 3 was the first crewed mission in NASA's Project Gemini. First time two American astronauts flew together into space.
Now, one of the major mission goals for our astronauts in space was to take pictures. As simple as that sounds, that's the simple truth. Astronauts had to be trained how to use a Hasselblad photo camera and a motion picture DAC camera to capture as much visual data as possible out there in space. Now, some of those pictures have made their way into the public, either by NASA publishing them themselves, or in certain circumstances, some of those photos being leaked by other institutions linked to NASA. Now, unfortunately, due to the classified nature of some photos or film that would have been taken in space, NASA has declared some of their records to be lost or destroyed. Now, the public in the early days of space travel were very naive to this. However, UFO and space researchers have constantly gone over the records to find anything that may be deemed anomalous.
Talked about getting a good camera, and we looked at the Hasselblad, and I finally got a Hasselblad camera. But before I got it, I talked to Ralph Morse and Carl Meidens of Life magazine. What's the best camera? Hasselblad. Really? All four of you agree? These were individual interviews, really. But for this, but for that. We took all the but-fors out and made a perfect Hasselblad at the Cape. That was when Pan Am had the laboratory down there. And Pan Am people made all these modifications. Victor Hasselblad came out with Hasselblad 500C, which was our version, after we made those changes. We got some good pictures. I think I could have taken better pictures, but I was too busy doing other things.
On Gemini 4, Ed White became the first American to make an extravehicular activity, EVA, or spacewalk, on June 3, 1965. Mounted next to the pilot's seat, on the right side of the spacecraft, the VTR was used by the astronauts to verbally document many visual observations they made during each flight. Although originally classified, the VTR transcripts for all 10 Gemini missions can be today found in the NASA archives.
General McDivitt, have you ever seen a UFO?
Yes. During my flight on Gemini 4 in 1965, I saw an object in space fairly close to our spacecraft that I could not identify. It looked to me like maybe the upper stage of another rocket. I tried to take some pictures of it, but unfortunately, the pictures did not come out properly. Never were able to identify what it was, and all of our ground radar tracking data indicated that there shouldn't have been another object anywhere near us at the time.
The next day, McDivitt again discusses.
We are a very visual species. This is how we learn about our universe around us, and therefore it makes sense for all space missions to be highly outfitted with camera, motion picture technology that the astronauts will use to capture this visual data.
Gemini 5, August 21st to 29th, 1965, demonstrated the 8-day endurance necessary for an Apollo lunar mission. With the first use of fuel cells to generate its electric power.
Now, due to the fact that NASA reported many mission photos or mission picture archives as lost or destroyed, the public would have been completely in the dark about any strange UFO events that happened up there, had it not been for the declassification of these incredible VTR transcript documents. And furthermore, after that declassification, we wouldn't know what we do today without all the hard work that had been done by NASA researchers like Luna Cognita.
When things went wrong with hooking up with, you know, Wally Schirra's part of that part of your mission, and hooking up with 6A, and you know, and that mission was juggled around and changes were suggested, and you played a role in deciding what was finally going to happen. Walk us through that.
Well, we were down at the Cape for the launch of Gemini 6, and the Agena went off, and everybody thought they had a good target vehicle. Turns out it blew up after it was out of sight. But in any event, before we walked out of that blockhouse, John Yardley and Chris Kraft and some other were already starting, how can we use Gemini 7 as a target vehicle?
Gemini 6A accomplished the first space rendezvous with its sister craft Gemini 7 in December 1965. With Gemini 7 setting a 14-day endurance record for its flight.
We had a lot of interesting things. Some of the doctors say, oh, well, in order to do that, you're going to have to simulate it on Earth and see if you can stay in 1G for 14 days. And they're out of their mind. 14 days sitting in a straight-up ejection seat on Earth, you're crazy. And so I was able, NASA at that time listened to the crew members when we were in areas, so we were able to get that nonsense kicked out in a hurry. And then we just went about our business doing the best we could.
So they wanted you all to, what, simulate?
Yeah. 2 weeks on 1G. Come on, give me a break. That didn't last
With
long.
no bathroom breaks or anything?
No, just in 1G.
Just
well, I
you
don't
and-
think you could do that.
Just you and Jim Lovell.
During the late 1990s, NASA collaborated with C-SPAN to do a retired astronaut interview campaign. This was an excellent time to hear from our early astronauts some of the nuances of their missions and details that maybe people didn't understand in the public. Not surprisingly, though, every time these astronauts were interviewed, there was time taken to debunk any UFO-related rumors.
Gemini 7 spacecraft was the passive target for the first crewed space rendezvous performed by the crew of Gemini 6A. Pilot James A. Lovell, command pilot Frank F. Borma.
Gemini 7 here, Houston, out of your 8. 1 clear, 7, go ahead. Bogey at 10 o'clock high. This is Houston, say again, 7. We have a bogey at 10 o'clock high. Right here.
Gemini Control here again. The reference in that conversation was bogey. It was Borman who reported sighting the bogey. This is Gemini Control Houston at 4 hours, 24 minutes into the flight.
This interview seems suspicious to some who will listen to and observe Frank's reaction, followed by his awkward answer in which he delivers. You know, an interesting fact to add to all of this is that many astronauts, including the Apollo mission's Dr. Edgar Mitchell, were mysteriously attracted to the Roswell, New Mexico area in their later days.
Were there any other things from your Gemini mission that, and they specifically want you to tell, maybe things that weren't in your book Countdown? Any stories that you've...
No, the interesting thing, one of the interesting things was flying formation with the second stage that put us into orbit, and using an infrared sensor to track that. We refer to it as a bogey all the time, which is natural, normal parlance. And when we got back, True Magazine wrote a big story about how we'd been tracking a UFO and all that nonsense. So I've been plagued with that ever since. People say, well, if you go into UFO circles today, they'll still tell you, well, we saw a UFO, which is foolish.
And look where you moved.
I'm sorry?
Look where you moved, UFO country.
That's right. Over here in Roswell, that's right.
Gemini 8.
It's important to be clear that not everything that was photographed or discussed in Earth orbit by the Gemini astronauts was a credible UFO. Some things were most definitely space debris, possibly ice, and of course, NASA's own equipment like the Agena craft. Skepticism is important when it comes to finding the greatest truth.
Gemini 8 achieved the first space docking with an unmanned Agena target vehicle. Pilot David R. Scott. Command pilot Neil A. Armstrong. In Gemini 9, the Augmented Target Docking Adapter, or ATDA's, deck only partially opened, so the Gemini spacecraft was unable to perform the docking. Nevertheless, Stafford and Cernan performed several approach maneuvers with the ATDA, including simulating the rescue of a lunar module in low Earth orbit. Command Pilot Thomas Stafford. Pilot Eugene A. Cernan. Gemini 10 established that radiation at high altitude was not a problem, further demonstrated the ability to rendezvous with a passive object, and was the first Gemini mission to fire the Agena's own rocket. Michael Collins would be the first person to meet another spacecraft in orbit during his second successful EVA. Command Pilot John W. Young and Pilot Michael Collins.
So NASA's in the mix here. NASA has, it's known as a allegedly civilian organization, but it's never been a pure civilian-oriented organization. We all know this, right? So they've had military connections throughout their history. And when you are engaged in any capacity with the U.S. military, a lot of those missions were not, the public wasn't told that they're classified missions. Of course they're not told that, because they're classified. And so, but that means that they are bound by those very same classifications and secrecy protocols that anyone in the military is. And that includes the connection with UFOs.
Gemini 11 first direct ascent, first orbit, rendezvous with an Agena target vehicle, docking with it 1 hour 34 minutes after launch, set a crude Earth orbital altitude record of 739.2 nautical miles, or 1,369 kilometers, in September 1966. Using the Agena target vehicle's propulsion system, this record still stands as of 2020.
Gemini 11, 1966, September 12th to September 15th. Pete Conrad and Gordon performed the first direct descent rendezvous with the Agena target vehicle. However, aside from this amazing feat by NASA, and it was an incredible feat by NASA, they encountered something that simply could not be explained. And to make things better, Pete Conrad was able to get photographs that have now been declassified. Many of you out there already know the Gemini program was littered with UFO sightings, unexplainable anomalies, classified voice recordings, photographic evidence, videos, transcripts, secrecy. The list goes on and on and on. Now, over the years, we've been able to piece together this mysterious puzzle left behind by NASA. It's a well-documented fact that anyone assigned to these programs, that they know more than they're willing to tell the general public. I believe they are fearful of ridicule by NASA or losing future opportunities in the space program. And again, this is a well-documented fact.
This is Houston. Say again, 7.
And by comparison, this is a stark, dramatic contrast to the recent comments given by one of the highest ranking people at NASA, Bill Nelson, where he goes on to say he believes we are not alone. He believes there is life outside of our planet. He also talks about closed-door meetings with the men and women involved in the USS Nimitz.
So, do I think there's life out there? Yes. Yes. I cannot limit this universe to be just here. Larry, before we leave, I hadn't even talked about the search for extraterrestrial life. For life in this universe. First of all, we're looking for life right now. What do you think we're doing on Mars? What do you think? We're looking for life. This is a part of NASA's mission. That's what this telescope is going to be looking for. Are there other planets elsewhere that there is life? Now, I know what you've seen is what those Navy pilots saw in 2004, and there have been some 300 sightings since then. And I've talked to those pilots, and they know they saw something, and their radars locked onto it. And then all of a sudden it was here on the surface, and then it's there.
Okay, now that we've heard from Bill Nelson, again, the highest ranking member of NASA, let's go back to 1966. Pete Conrad sends NASA a radio transmission that can be found on page 106 of the official NASA voice transcript. He goes on to say, quote, "We have a large object tumbling about 1 revolution per second close to us, and I took photographs of it." And another very important detail, this sighting was also later analyzed in the Condon report, but ultimately labeled as simply being the Proton 3 satellite. NASA has never given any explanation to the UFO sighting. The only agency to step forward with any type of answer was, of all people, NORAD, and they simply dismissed this UFO sighting as the Proton 3 satellite that was nearly 3,000 miles away around the curvature of the Earth, and it would have been literally impossible for Conrad to see this from his spacecraft. Even our modern-day cameras equipped on the ISS are incapable of filming something that far away. And it also needs to be noted that a large part of that Condon report was mysteriously missing the UFO encounter. In fact, the entire UFO incident was removed from the Condon report. So what were they hiding? We know what they were hiding, but through the Freedom of Information Act, we now have the complete copy of that transcript and the Condon report. And based on this report, it is clear as day NASA has been hiding the truth about this UFO sighting from the public since 1966. We now have high-res photographs from the Gemini NASA archives and the Arizona State University School of Earth and Space, along with the corresponding ID numbers provided by NASA. And in these photographs, we can clearly see there is something there that simply should not be there, and it's definitely not the Proton 3 satellite. One thing I would like to add is this iconic photo taken during Gemini 10 by John Young and Michael Collins, 1966. This photo is believed to be some type of UFO orbiting Earth, but I believe this is the Gemini Agena target vehicle, and the sun is simply reflecting off the side. If you look at the other photos in the NASA gallery series, and that's how they categorize them, you can clearly see this is most likely the Agena target vehicle. So always try to debunk any of these UFO sightings first before I bring them to the public. But as always, you guys decide. And as far as I know, this one here, this is the only photograph of the cylinder UFO Conrad reported in the NASA transcripts and has openly talked about to the public after he left NASA. And I was also able to find this really quick video clip that is believed to be taken by Conrad of this cylinder UFO. And of course, one of the most well-known and famous photographs from the Gemini program is this one right here. And we can clearly see what appears to be two UFOs monitoring the NASA Gemini spacecraft. And to this day, I've never seen or never heard of anyone that was able to debunk it. So in closing, like all of you out there, I simply want to know, are we alone in this enormous universe? Is there life outside of our planet? What is our government hiding? What is NASA hiding? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How did we get here? These are universal curiosities, and we simply want the truth.
We have been visited on this planet, and the UFO phenomenon is real, although it's been covered up by our governments for quite a long time. It is a real phenomenon. And there's quite a few of us that it's been well covered up by all of our governments for the last 60 years.
The only problem that we have with our early space missions is that at that time, our astronauts were very loyal, obedient, and therefore tight-lipped about what was really observed up there. We've also added to the problem that NASA's de facto answer to any anomalous UFO events which occurred has always been that it was nothing but ice, space debris, or satellites, or something alike.
During the same year in which the X-15 missions were underway, NASA and the Brookings Institution commissioned a report titled "The Proposed Studies on the Implications of Peaceful Space Activities for Human Affairs." The report is made most famous for its section titled "The Implications of a Discovery of Extraterrestrial Life." This section examines the potential implications of such a discovery, most notably that some information should be withheld from the public. Examples include a controlled thermonuclear fusion rocket power source and face-to-face meetings with extraterrestrials.
If the early space age has heralded so many UFO encounters in space that have been well documented over the years, and recently by the CIA's very own UFO document release in 2020, well, you can imagine, what did the astronauts see in space during the Apollo manned missions?
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh.